They are literally insane. Ukraine has no leverage here, none whatsoever. The credibility of the Ukrainian government in the United States is zero. It doesn't matter that Democrats care about Ukraine. The Democrats aren't in power, and they won't be in power for at least 2 years. There's no potential of them resuming this. Ukraine won't survive 2 years. Ukraine won't survive until the summer. Um, and so, that's where we're at right now. This is it's difficult to be a Ukrainian today. It's difficult to be a Ukrainian negotiator because there's nothing to negotiate. This is like the Germans going to the Russians, General Krebs going to General Chukov at the fall of Berlin and saying, I want to negotiate terms of surrender. And Chukov said, there are no terms of surrender. It's unconditional surrender. Sign the paper or die. And that's where Ukraine is today. Sign the paper or die.
US-Präsident Trump verfolgt das Ziel eines Friedensschlusses zwischen der Ukraine und Russland äußerst hartnäckig. Zumindest oberflächlich scheint es derzeit das Hauptaugenmerk der US-Außenpolitik zu sein. Es gibt aber zahlreiche geopolitische Experten, die die tatsächlichen Motive hinterfragen. Während Trump in Richtung Russland auf Dialog und Entspannung setzt, verschärft er seinen Kurs gegenüber China, droht sogar offen mit Handelskrieg und Militär. Braucht Trump Frieden in Europa, um die US-Ressourcen für den Kampf gegen China mobilisieren zu können? Plant er womöglich Russland diplomatisch zu umwerben und somit dessen Bündnis mit China zu lockern? Und wird sich Russland darauf einlassen?
I don't know. The last time I looked, the Russians weren't governed by children. Children believe in fairy tales, and children can be influenced by promises of, toys and playtime and this and that. The Russians aren't children. The Russians live in a real world. The current status of this real world is that Russia and China, prior to the special military operation beginning, met in Beijing in February of 2022, where they issued a 5,000-word joint document. Read that document very carefully. That's the direction, the strategic direction that both Russia and China are involved in. It involves taking down the rules-based international order, which was the primary foreign policy, direction of the Biden administration. Now, Donald Trump has said that he is against sustaining the rules-based international order, and so there seems to be some confluence here between Russia, China, and the United States. The United States is not looking for a war with anybody, but the United States has to untangle the complications of decades of bad policy. And so what Trump is doing with China is basically setting the stage. But what you didn't say is that right now the Chinese and the Americans are talking about Donald Trump going to Beijing in April. Now, why would the President of the United States go to Beijing for a major foreign policy trip if he wants to go to war with China? He's going to Beijing to reset relations with China. He's preparing the battlefield by at least educating the Chinese about what the potential could be if they don't reset relations. But Trump isn't dumb enough to believe that he has any leverage over China. He's going to meet with China to normalize relations between China and the United States, to take us away on a path away from military confrontation. We recognize, both the Chinese and the United States, that we have complicated economic relations, and that especially in the Pacific, we have some geopolitical entanglements that have to be worked out. But we're not going to go to war over it. This is the important factor. When Donald Trump speaks of pulling out of Europe, it's not that we're pulling out military power that has to be reallocated to the Pacific so that we can fight the Chinese. It's so that we reduce our exposure globally so that there can be a reallocation of diplomatic and economic priorities to the Pacific. Why are we disentangling ourselves from the European Union? Because we recognize that the European Union is an economic loser for us. We don't want to continue policies that entangle us in Europe to the detriment of our potential in the Pacific. But it's not about pulling military forces out and replugging for a war. It's about reprioritizing our national direction. We want to peacefully coexist with China. You see, the concept of splitting China and Russia apart is a Kissinger type thinking back to the Nixon era, the Cold War, where our primary interface with the world was military in nature. So we thought in military terms to weaken a Soviet-Chinese axis by splitting them and turning them against each other. Today, we are seeking to de-emphasize war as the primary mechanism of American power projection. Instead, we're trying to emphasize diplomacy and economic engagement. We are seeking to economically engage with Russia, not to weaken China, but to prevent war from breaking out in Europe and elsewhere. And I think, given the fact that we have expressed a new appreciation for reality when we speak of our foreign policy, that these realists also understand that you cannot divide Russia and China, that that will not happen. That actually, if you want to have good relations with China, you need to have good relations with Russia, because otherwise they will come together against you. But if you are in good favor with both, you can work with both to achieve sound, comprehensive, mutually beneficial economic relations. And that's the direction the United States heading. We're not heading towards a war with China. We're heading towards peace with China. And I think you'll see this when Donald Trump meets with Xi Jinping in Beijing in April.
Die EU-Führung will von einem Kurswechsel gegenüber Russland nichts wissen. EU-Kommissionspräsidentin von der Leyen kündigte jüngst ein Aufrüstungspaket in Höhe von 800 Milliarden Euro an. Der französische Präsident Macron warnte vor der angeblichen russischen Bedrohung des ganzen Kontinents und sprach von einem nuklearen Abwehrschirm. Polen will seine Militärausgaben verdoppeln. Können die EU-Zwerge wirklich militärisch mithalten mit Russland ohne US-Unterstützung? Haben sie das Rüstungspotenzial dazu? Und was lässt sich realistisch gesehen mit den 800 Milliarden Euro anfangen?
Well, look, we just have to look to history as our guide. In 2022, Olaf Scholz, the former chancellor of Germany, proudly announced a $100 billion infusion, 100 billion euro infusion into Germany's defense to rebuild Germany, to prepare Germany to be able to stand up against the Russian threat. Here we are. Oh, let's just say 2 years later in 2024, that money was gone and Germany's military was weaker, shrinking. What happened to 100 billion? First of all, it's a loan to themselves, which means immediately you have to pay back the loan. So right off the bat, interest payments alone chop that 100 billion down to, I don't know, 67 billion. And the longer you hold on to the money, the greater the appreciation is. So a year in, they had already spent most of that, or at least half of that money, paying the loan back. Now they have 50 billion euro to do what? To invest into literally a money pit. You know, this isn't about refurbishing my home. I mean, my wife and I have been looking at my house for some time and saying, look, it's a house getting close to 50 years old. There's things that have to happen here. So we need to, replace this, replace that, upgrade this, upgrade that. And we can do that because the house is structurally sound. There's no black mold. There's no rot here. And so the money that we allocate will do the job we want it to do. Get the house up into working order, sustain the house, make it a valuable property for years to come. But if we went down the road, there's a house that's been abandoned for 30 years and it's rotten. I mean, it may look like a house, but when you go inside, you can smell the mold, you can smell the rot. You touch the wood, it's falling apart. We can't take the same amount of money that would be used to bring our house up in order and invest it in that. In fact, we invested in and we would lose that money and the structure would become even worse because as we seek to try to repair it, we expose more frailties and faults and eventually the house will collapse. Europe's military posture is derived from a Cold War era, structure that was designed to confront the Soviet Union in a defensive war. They put a lot of money into building structures that were designed to repel or a Soviet attack. At the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union went away, NATO, instead of restructuring itself, maintain this Cold War era structure. Its militaries were never given different missions. They were always given the mission of Article 5 collective defense. But that mission no longer existed. There was no longer an impetus. So the House stood there and started to rot because we didn't maintain it. They didn't maintain it. They didn't put in the investments. They started doing other things like buying a car, buying a vacation home, going to Libya, going to Afghanistan, instead of focusing on what needed to be focused on. They forgot about high intensity conflict. They don't know how to build tanks anymore. They don't know how to use tanks anymore. They don't know how to do anything anymore. NATO is broken. It is a rotten edifice. It cannot function. And you're going to take 800 billion euro and invest it in there. First of all, it's a 14% interest rate. So you're borrowing 800 billion euro and immediately you got to start making payments. And the longer you hold on to that money, the more that money goes into making the payments. So you're not getting 800 billion euros worth of military investment. An investment into what? You literally have to tear down NATO and start over, which would be my advice. Instead of taking 800 billion and trying to rebuild this Cold War thing, you can't. It would cost you 800 trillion to do that. And you still won't get it done because your entire defense structures aren't geared. You're not thinking right. You don't have the focus. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the training. You don't have anything. So this is a joke. Shows you how immature Europe is as an entity, as an institution, that they think that this problem can be solved by spending their way out of it, instead of taking an honest look at what they're doing. Is Russia a threat? That is the fundamental question. And the answer is no, Russia is not. So therefore, what kind of defense structures do you need for Europe? Do you need to spend money to be prepared to be engaged in offensive military operations against Russia? The answer is no, you don't. How about defensive military operations against Russia? No, Russia's not threatening to invade. So what military do you need? That's what Europe needs to ask themselves. What military do we need? Is Europe going to be an expeditionary force projecting power into Africa? The answer is no, it should not be. Is Europe going to be an expeditionary force projecting power into Asia? No, it should not be. Is Europe going to have collective defense? Maybe that's what they should be looking at. Realistic collective defense so that you can prioritize your spending, domestic and military, and not bankrupt yourself in the process. I just solved Europe's problem right now. If they listen to me, they'll be doing quite well in the future, but they won't listen to me. They're going to bankrupt themselves. I can guarantee you this, that 800 billion will only make Europe weaker. It will destroy them economically. It'll get them involved in projects they cannot sustain. It's like starting a home improvement project and saying, okay, honey, let's rip up the floors. And we rip up the floors. And then we start going, we go, oh, we ran out of money. We can't replace the floors, but we got holes in the floor. We just ruined the house. And now we have to spend even more, but we don't have. So we borrow more. This is what's happening here. Europe is literally going to commit economic suicide by going down this path. And all Russia has to do is sit back and laugh. This is the easiest victory Russia has ever been given. Just sit back and laugh at Europe as they commit suicide. This is why America's unplugging from you, because you are insane collectively. You have allowed yourselves to be hijacked by these unelected bureaucrats who are committing 800 billion euro to a project that doesn't need to exist. And where's the objections? Where's people standing up saying, no, no, we're not going to do this?